Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Teens for Business podcast. I'm so glad you guys could join us on today's episode, and I'm your host, Ivan.
I'm Kylie.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Jackie.
Today we will be discussing the importance of a sports development program towards youth on the economy of a country. And the topic of this debate was brought up because recently a Chinese athlete named Qing Haiyang, I think that's how they call it, set a world record in the 200-meter breaststroke. And this brings to light on the many sports development programs that exist within different countries, specifically in China. And these programs are usually government sponsored and they utilize government funding to invest in recruiting and training potential international superstar athletes. And many sports are focused on, especially swimming and diving. However, this is often not the case in many different countries. And this leads to the kind of topic we have today, which is how important is sports and specifically a sports development program for youth towards and the economy of a country. And specifically, what role should educational institutions and government play in fostering sports development among young athletes? So, in my opinion, I think that a sports development program for youth is pretty important for the economy of a certain country. Like specifically in the United States, we see like typically private schools and some public places where they've developed sports, and it's usually just basketball or football or sometimes baseball, but it's usually typically those like three big sports. And like there's like a really famous private school, I think in Florida, it's called IMG Academy. And then they're like, I think they recruit high school athletes, and then so they fly to Florida and they play basketball basically all day. And obviously it has turned out well because a lot of those players go to play like college sports, and then eventually, maybe if they're playing basketball in the NBA or football in the NFL, stuff like that. So what else do you guys think?
Just to address that question, for me, I think that sports is like obviously like important to like the economy, but like if you have to do like a sports like development program specifically sports geared, I think that might not be the best way to train like sports because like even if you want to like train sports and you want to like get like get recruited to like the big leagues and like all of that for different athletes, like their careers are mainly focused on like sports. And I know some athletes they do some outside ventures such as like investing or starting up a business or a nonprofit to help other young athletes. But sometimes some of these athletes, since they're so geared into like sports, they don't like necessarily like learn too well much of this like the skills necessary for like to like continue their careers potentially like after sports. Like they might have to some athletes like for example Jared Smith have kind of like gone back into like education just to like get the education that they need like after they've ended their sports careers.
Yeah, I think that also to that point, it's like sports obviously are important, but at the end of the day, for like professionals, there's only that many professional teams or like only professional spots per se that you can have. And there's a lot of like youth athletes who like dedicate their entire lives and put so much hard work, so much passion into becoming a professional athlete, but it's still like a almost like selective process. Like just because you spent so much time, so much energy, that doesn't mean you'll actually be able to make it onto the professional or like global stage. And to a lot of those kids, it's like if you focus, okay, if you're like focusing so much money on that, you're obviously going to have more students who are trying to like be a professional athlete, but those numbers like are still proportionate. Like not everyone's going to be able to make it, and then there's going to be so many more kids who spent their entire lives playing like like soccer, waking up at like 5 in the a.m. in the morning to train, and then going to sleep at like 12 and at night, and doing so much work, and then at the end of the day, like they missed out on their entire childhood. They missed out on like an academic education. They missed out on other things like that, just to not be able to make it as a professional player. And I think obviously there are kids who will end up doing what they love, but there also is, like, if you encourage a program like that, you also encourage the development of a lot of other kids not being able to fulfill their dreams after so much hard work.
I think part of that is true, but I also think that like if kids are passionate about whatever sport that they want to play, then I think that even though like in the end, like Jackie said, it's going to be super hard to make it like professionally because of the limited amount of players there are that can play at that level. But if people do train because they're passionate about the sport and they want to train, and these programs are going to help these kids do that. And I know these are programs that may take away from their academically, but they're still going to school. They're still and they're still training in whatever sport that they're passionate about. I think it's still a win-win in terms that, like, looking at the economic side of things. I think that these like sports programs they create lots of jobs for other people as well. And it just there's a lot of revenue, there's a lot of money to be made in sports, not just with the players, but also with sporting events, all the staff and things like that. So I just think that in terms of in a broader sense, these sports programs are still bringing good to the kids and to the broader economy as well.
Yeah, like on adding on to that point, I think it's obviously we mentioned that the swimmer in the beginning, how he broke a world record for breaststroke, and compared to like other professional swimmers in the US, like we obviously have Michael Phelps and whatnot, and obviously the US has been extremely dominant in like many sports, especially swimming. And typically you don't really see like a lot of private institutions just training swimming. It's usually like some kind of like after school activity, some sort of that. But as we move on to countries like China, where they actually have like government sponsored schools that like do half day, like this have a curriculum, like they learn all like math, like all the stuff, but they also have like a big chunk of their day dedicated towards a sport they're doing. Like, and there are like a lot of schools in China that actually do that, and there's much fewer schools that in the US do that kind of intense training. So what are your guys' opinions? Should there be more institutions like this? Because obviously it for China it is working, because more and more athletes, especially in diving, which China is really dominant in and obviously spend a lot of resources on, and like more sports like volleyball, swimming, stuff like that, and it's working out for them and probably for the economy as well. So what do you think? Should we have more of these programs or less so, as obviously there's concerns about like actually having, a good education?
I definitely advocate for this type of system because I think for the American system, while there's like in high school or like in college, you could do like both like academics and like sports, a large percentage of the student athletes lean towards like the sports, and they like kind of like brush off a little bit of their like academic career just to like focus on like sports, going to practice for 4, 5, 6 hours, and they just really want to get to the sport, but they're also like missing a little bit of the academic education and they're like missing a little bit of like the common core standards set by like states and like governments and that. So definitely a concern for student athletes is if they eventually get recruited, or if they like are unable to get recruited, like what could they do potentially after like their sporting careers like over, or after like they retire. So I feel like if you do like a half academic, half athletic, like I guess like a school system, it could definitely help. Like student athletes attain the academic education they might need to like potentially continue some portion of their career after the sporting or athletic career is over.
I think that like at some point, I think kids know like what level they're playing at and how good they are. So I think in terms of like if a kid isn't going to be good enough to play at that next level, then they should know that, and like they should be able to commit themselves to doing something else that's going to help them in the future, something academic maybe, or something in another field. But if students are really that good and they're able to play college and then play whatever sport they are at, play professionally, and they're able to make money through that, then that even like if they're playing sports like different programs like IMG, they're gonna be able to get scholarships for college, and that's gonna be their educational opportunity where they're gonna be able to learn in college while also playing the sport that they want to play. And yeah, I just think that in terms of like saying that if a student isn't good enough, like they might not have any options, and they should also like there should be people around them telling them, like making sure that they know what their future path is, so they don't make mistakes like um not being able to like pursue whatever sport they want to pursue at the next level.
I like what Kaiwen said, like people, since there's so many kids trying to like be a professional athlete, like there's like recruiting systems too. Like Kaiwen should be more familiar with this, but like I'm aware there's like they rate high school athletes on a score of 5 stars or 4 stars, I forgot. And then like it depends, like if you're extremely good, you're like a 4 star or 5 star recruit. And then like if you're like decent, not that good, you're like a 1 star recruit. And like if you're not in a development program, like IMGs, I think it's pretty hard to get those stars. Like from social media, um, I'm aware that like people from smaller high schools or small town high schools in the country, they don't, even though they're like probably like one of the top 10 players in the nation, they're probably not even ranked as in high school athletes. So what do you guys think about like this kind of ranking system? Is it beneficial? Obviously towards college recruiters, definitely beneficial. They can rate high school athletes and choose like the best one for them. But like, is it really fair for high school athletes who don't really have the resources to fly to Florida or like talk to IMG Academy or other academy recruiters? Is it really fair for them?
I kind of feel like it is like a little bit unfair because like I guess like college scouts like when they're looking for like recruited when when they're looking for student athletes that could potentially become like athletes in high schools or colleges, like they might look at like the big programs where like they recruited like a lot of their students. Maybe they have like a bit of a legacy program or like a partnership with some other like school that's also like super competitive, and that's like more like well known. But there could also be like super young stars from like more like rural and less well known areas that could definitely like be like really good like players that could be like recruited and probably would deserve the opportunities to like go and like pursue a potential like student athlete career. So I think there's definitely a little bit of a flaw in like the ranking system right now, and and it kind of like limits the I guess the ability for students and recruited athletes from less well-known areas to be like actually recruited and potentially pursue an athletic career.
Yeah, like what I was saying with the stars, it's gonna be a lot harder for kids to kind of like get recruited if their school isn't very well known. I'm not 100% familiar with like how, in terms of like how high school recruiting works, but like all of the like I've seen a lot of kids in high school basketball specifically, they like transfer. They go to a school initially and then they transfer to a more well-known program like IMG or something like Prolific Prep or something. Those are like the two ones that I know. And then from there, they either get ranked, they're on ESPN's ranking list, and then a lot of the time they transfer back to their original high school just to graduate from there, or they know people from there, so they go back to the original high school. I think it's just that different programs are just so well known that if you're a high school athlete, and you have the money or resources to kind of go off to these well-known programs, then that's what these kids are doing, just because that's how you get on college scouts radars first. And then yeah, from there it's just that it's a lot of like it is unfair in the fact that you do need the money and resources to be able to go to these programs. And yeah, these are the ways that right now kids are getting scouted for college.
Yeah, and
Yeah, I mean, I think in a with that, oh yeah, I think in a point with that, I think it's well, one of my best friends is getting recruited to MIT for soccer, and MIT, like even though it's like a really good academic institution, is D3. And what she's told me about it is that like because like we go to a public school, but it's a really, really big public school. She says that it's very like you have to do a lot of scouting like on your own end. You have to like really reach out to them, email them, like get the students and to be recruited because at the end of the day, most like recruited athletes aren't like 100% superstars. Like yeah, they might have like many different offers, but all of those offers are like they come from like the student reaching out. It's not like the coach was like, oh my god, I need to have this person. They are such a celebrity, and like everyone's rushing. Like you have to like kind of email people out, and then they like see you, and you're like, oh okay, like we actually want you for like MIT. Like I have another friend. She's Canadian, but she plays rugby, and she's getting recruited. She's still like having offers come in, but she might get recruited to Dartmouth or like Brown or like other D1 schools. And she says that like a lot of it is happening because like she has to reach out personally. And I think there is like a aspect of if you go to a good school or like a more well-known school that has had previous athletes or like previously successful college athletes, like that's going to be super important because the recruiter already kind of knows like your area, like knows like how the system that you operate in, knows things like that. But I think like also if you're in like a smaller town, a smaller school, if you're able to like reach out to those people and like you're able to like do some of that back end networking, like that's still a lot more work than if you go to a well-known school that already has all these established connections and then you already have like coaches coming to your games, like things like that. It is like a lot more difficult to get recruited if you're from a smaller town, but I mean, I think there's also like privilege everywhere. Like you can probably say that for like regular like academic college acceptances. So I think like it's a fair argument, but at the same time, like it also applies everywhere else. So something it's kind of difficult to solve.
So and this kind of like drizzles down into high school where there's like private academies opening up, and like they know there's a lot of money in sports, and they kind of like train focus only on certain sports. And I know IMG Academy has been brought up a lot, but it is a private institution. So what do you guys think about like the business aspect? Is it like okay to earn money off of like training high school athletes and just for the sake of earning money, or should it be, or would it be better to be like focusing on the development of the athlete and making sure they're becoming a good athlete and not like burning out and stuff like that?
I definitely think that I think the money earned by an organization or a sports academy or just like a sports school in general, it should correlate with I think it should correlate with the success and the quality of the athletes produced.
But I also think that like not all athletes who do go to IMG are like going to be successfully like college recruited or like yeah or like go to the pros or even are college recruited. I just think that and they definitely don't treat all the students there the same. I think part of what needs to happen is that I know that they're going to prefer like the stars, right? The people who are like the highest recruited athletes there. But if they're all paying the same amount of money to be there, then they should be getting the same amount of like the same level of treatment, the same level of attention and care as like all the other athletes. Otherwise, it's just like if they're just in it for making money, yeah, like we previously said, I think it's there needs to be some sort of like oversight. And so like how they're managing every single athlete that's part of their program.
Spending a lot of time and effort, training every day, knowing that you probably can't, try not to get cut from the team, and knowing that you're not going to be good enough to like be a professional on a professional level. And in schools like UMich, their football program is like a huge thing. And if you want to play football at this type of colleges, you're spending like at least a good 6-7 hours a day training for football, when it's off season and not a lot of time actually like, going to classes and studying your intended major. So yeah, that's the thing, but that kind of brings up one of our main problems of discussion today is like how big of a role should these educational institutions play in developing sports in the youth? And in fact, how much should the government invest in these type of programs?
I'm gonna start this one off. I think that like the academic, I mean, just like in educational institutions, like some which may be sports, which may not be sports, can definitely like have a role in terms of like developing student athletes. If there's a well-known academy that does like a lot of like work with developing student athletes, I think they could if they're like really like credible, they have like a ton of student athletes that come out and get recruited, then definitely it could be like a achievable goal for like I guess like students. But I also feel like the I guess institutions shouldn't put that much like right now I feel like that the proportion for like some institutions is like I guess like 80% sports, like maybe like 20% academics, or maybe a little bit lower on academics. But I definitely think for right now they have like even though they have like a huge influence with like sporting careers and sports development, there should definitely be a little bit more of a balance between sports and academics, which can like foster like a good like academic education just in case their sporting plans just don't go to like just don't like end up being what does happen. And I feel like the government has done I'm not too sure actually about the government like in terms of like funding and like supporting these like private institutions, but I think maybe the government should subsidize maybe potentially more academic programs in these like sporting like institutions and academies so that the student athletes there could just like receive the academic education that they need as just what I said before as just in case the student athletes like athletic careers like just don't go to plan as if they don't get recruited or something like that.
Yeah, just to like chip in, like I'm just gonna ask Jack, like I think you're focusing on like the United States in general, but like how about other countries like China or maybe Japan, Korea, like a lot of these Asian countries, they have the money, but they don't really have like they didn't really focus on the sports development aspect until really recently. And it's becoming obvious like Japan is great at basically almost all the sports now. Like it's crazy like how quickly they've progressed. And also China, right? They used to be extremely poor, but when they started getting their economy started getting like growing, they also started investing the money into like these development programs for youth. And it's obviously working. Like China's dominating a lot of sports, like both winter and summer, very distinctly. So like what is your opinion on like the government spending money and it's working like for these countries are working and they're gonna do this for like years. But as compared to the US, like the government's kind of hands off because the business is already extremely lucrative and there's already enough money for developing these athletes. So what do you think about that?
I think it could be definitely like profitable for like governments that like have like a countries that sports isn't as popular as the United States. Like in the United States, like sports is obviously a really popular pastime. A lot of people know a lot of things about like different sports. A lot of people watch NFL, NBA, and like a lot of like other sports in terms of like variety. But like some other countries, like they haven't like really started their sports development until like I guess like this like century almost like in the 2000s like they started ramping up their sports development. I feel like it could I feel like the government investing like a lot into like sports institutions it could be really helpful potentially for the country's economy because like obviously sports like brings in a lot of like tourism in like for example in Qatar we recently had the World Cup there brought a ton of tourists to Qatar and helping them with their like economy. So definitely I think sports investment from the government can be super beneficial to like attract more people to like attract like more tourists to like visit and just like also like raising like the sports investment can also like bring like athletes and like I guess like just like attract like people to like potentially more sports and just raising the economy in like general.
Yeah, I think that like outside of the US, I don't think sports is as big of a thing. So probably these programs would need government funding if they want to sustain a viable sports program. And I do think this is reasonable just because like sports brings so much to a country if you have successful like figures. It's just like the branding and the image of like a successful athlete. Like for China, like there's I know that they put a lot of money into like their programs to train for the Olympics and such, just because like these medals they mean so much to the country as a whole. And yeah, I just think that yeah, in terms of like how the amount of jobs it creates as well, just like because you're putting money into these programs, but these programs also create a lot of revenue in terms of job creation and help a lot of people in that sense as well. I just think yeah, most countries should be if sports aren't as big where private funding isn't going to be enough in those countries, then the government should definitely be sponsoring a couple of these programs that build these superstar athletes.
Yeah, I'd be inclined to agree, but also I think like when you look at like economic impacts of sports, like, obviously that's huge, like that's really big. Like I think Super Bowls, like World Cups, obviously Olympics, like they bring in so much money on the whole. But again, like if we're considering like that within the context of like youth development or like youth sports development, it's like again, like I think my earlier argument still applies. Like yes, you have these like top-notch sporting events that bring in so much money for the country, the local economy, for whatever, but then only a fraction of athletes actually make it to like the international, like the big pro stage. And that's something to consider. And also like I think someone, I forgot who it was, someone brought up the point of like I won't get recruited, but you know, I'll be a pretty good recreational tennis player, or like I won't make it to like the pro level, but I can totally get myself recruited into college. Like you kind of know where you are, but I think like that's like when you have a big gap. Like a lot of my friends from school who are like getting recruited to like D3 or D1 colleges, like they kind of know like they'll be able to do it in like college, like they'll be fine, like getting recruited and everything, but they know for sure that they'll not like go on to be a pro. But I think like when you're in that level, it's like, you know, kind of obvious. Like you'll be like, yeah, okay, you know, this is something I'll do for fun in the future then. But there's also, I think, a group of people who are somewhere in the middle where it's like they totally can get recruited to college and like they might have a chance in becoming a professional. And I think that is where it becomes a little bit more dangerous in a sense, because like if you're like, oh, if I just work harder, if I just like put more effort and I might be able to get recruited, like to being an like, might be able to get drafted, I think is a better word, to get drafted into like the pro level. And I think that's where it gets a little bit like tricky to handle, because not everyone in that category can get drafted into the pros. And a lot of people there, like you put in so much time, so much energy and thinking that you'll be able to, but then you won't. And then that's always like kind of sad to see someone to like put in so much energy, like be so good at D1, like put in like literally so many hours, and then not do it at that end. So that's also something, because like yeah, you might be able to, like, when you're like a little bit like a few levels off from becoming drafted, then it's obvious. But if you're like super close, then that's where it gets a little bit misty.
Yeah, definitely. Like we have in the NBA we have like the G League, and then in baseball you have a minor league, stuff like that, and NFL you have like NFL Europe. I'm not too sure, but like there's a lot of these leagues that are a tier lower than the professional ones. That kind of shows like if you put like basically the equivalent amount of effort and hours into playing a sport, but you just simply is not good enough. And that's just a sad thing. Just like the reality isn't always that kind of fruitful. Um, but I want to also bring up a point like these sports development programs, especially in like China, because there's like a huge rural area, right? And these areas, like even if they go to school, they just end up helping their families run a farm or something like that. And but these sports programs kind of give these families like a opportunity, an economic opportunity to, maybe transition, get a better equipment for their farm, or maybe like expand their farm, find new better crops to plant, or even move to the city and actually doing what they actually want instead of farming. And this is like a really big deal in China because a lot of the recruits actually do come from the rural areas. And many of the superstars that make it and go on the national team and win medals are also from the rural areas. So like, what is you guys' opinion on this? Because obviously that is China and doesn't apply to everywhere in the world. Like Japan, I know like the really good players are already from like the good parts of the country, and in the US too, like a lot of good players they already have the financial benefits, and there's a ton of programs, you know, for those like underprivileged players, like they're obviously really good. So like a lot of recruiters, that's where recruiters come to like recruit them. So what is your opinion on that? Like, should we keep on doing that and giving them opportunities? Um, or should we like kind of diversify a little bit, focus a little bit less on sports and not using sports as the excuse to like give people opportunities?
I think it could go both ways here. So I feel like there's like I know I'm like personally a fan of soccer, so I follow a lot of like players, and a lot of players like start from humble backgrounds. And recently, a lot of players have been attracted to, well, before COVID, it was the Chinese Super League, but now it's the Saudi Pro League. And that's because they get a lot of money to like support their like families where in which they like started their like I guess like their sporting interests. But those families didn't have that too many like resources. So I think a lot of like those athletes, like once they get like a ton of money, it's like a good way to like give back to like I guess like to better their family situations. So it could definitely be a very beneficial thing for those families who start off in humble like beginnings and then like rose up, got a lot of fame from the sporting things that they do, and then they ended up like helping their like families or in some cases helping their communities just like get better with like their like I'm just situation. But also like I guess this applies for like America, but I think again, like as I said before, I think because we've seen some athletes in America, they like based on the recruiting system, based on such a big emphasis in sports, like after their careers, sometimes they don't like really know where to like take it. And that's where the academic education could really come into play. So as I said before, I think there should be a little bit more of it like an academic emphasis in addition to like the sports. And I think this applies to mostly America, but I'm not sure which other nations have like similar things to America, but yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I definitely think academics should be a larger part of these kids' lives that are like in these sports programs, just because they need to be given the resources, like the opportunity to choose like what path they want to go into. I know like if you are really that good at sports and you think that you don't need academics, but like we've seen like NBA players come back or like different any like pro players, they come back and they get their diploma later just because no, education is important. It like gives kids like different options. So like from a young age, it's definitely necessary for them to be given these different options just so they are able to succeed in the future no matter what they're doing, whether it is like sports related or not. And I think that these programs need to be doing a better job of that.
I'm like kind of neutral on this question because like obviously we have like a lot of industries that are like really successful on its own, like the sports industry, they're like really like successful on its own. And in some cases like I guess like the academics like I mean once like I guess like a university like admits like students and makes them like graduate, like they're I guess a little bit of a goal is like to make those to like incentivize those alumni to get like a really good education, so those alumni pay the funds back to the university in terms of like grants and stuff like that. So I think there are definitely some industries that are definitely like successful on its own, And in some cases that could be like the education part, but in other cases, maybe the government could like allocate more, especially in like areas where there's not too much opportunities. But there are also like a lot of like concerns, just as what Ivan touched about, that the government does spend money on, and I think that maybe they can like just continue doing that. So the obvious, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think that government spending like for these programs, it is a good idea just because like it isn't only like they aren't the government isn't like just pouring money out of it into it and like not getting anything back. Like these programs are going to be making money as well, just because like of the popularity of like sports events. And it's also like I said, it's a job creation. It's going to create a lot of jobs, like event organizers or like whatever staff there's needed for these programs. And it's just like the amount of the brand imaging and the popularity a specific place is going to get from sports players is like just you're not going to be able to get that from anything else. I just sports is such a big part of like whoever whatever like of the USA, but like other countries as well. Sports is just such a big part of our lives that like putting money into the program is only going to make like it grow bigger, and it's going to make more money and create more jobs in the long run.
Yeah, I agree with that for like the most part, but I think also like there's kind of like a limit to how much that is. Like I think we talked about this in one of our other podcasts, so you guys could definitely go back and check. But basically, like what happens is that even if your sports team, like for example, actually there's not many good examples here, but like for example, like if you are in a super like major city like New York City, but your sports team is a little bit like not the best, like a lot of the times you will still have a pretty big fan base just because you are like New York City, you are LA, you are like some major city in the United States. Even if your team is a little not great, right? Like of course if your team is better, you probably get more fans, but you still have like that big like baseline of people who like you just because you exist in that big city. And that kind of is what happens because there's only that many people in a country. Well, okay, it sounds bad, but there's only that many people in a country, and so many people already like sports. So like that development base is a little bit like less stiff than if you or more stiff than if you focused on like developing new technology for the environment or like new technology for the economy, whatever. And I think like there has to be like a basis of like, are you doing this for recreational purposes? Are you doing it for like cultural things? Because for the US, like let's say like in the 20th century, like mid 20th century era, like baseball was literally like the defining cultural moment in sports. Like you think baseball, you think United States, like so dominantly that. And then I think like American football or like, like American things like as a cultural thing, not so much of like economy wise. And I think like those are both like super important to consider. Like if you can develop a sport as like literally a symbol for your culture, then that's still very impressive in itself, even like outside
Yeah,
of economic terms.
yeah, I definitely agree. Like thinking about what you said, Jackie, I think I realized like in the US, like the sports is less about like the country, but more about like the teams, like obviously the US is extremely good at certain many sports, like they're dominating basically like tens of different sports in the Olympics, but like it plays like a less of a role. Like people like, oh yeah, we did win the gold medal in the 100 like 200 meter run, whatever. But like when like their favorite team, like NBA team wins, they get more hyped, but as opposed to like maybe or like countries that value like nationalism or culture like holding everyone together like a family, like the countries that value those more like China, Japan, Korea, like these Asian countries like value their culture is based off of like being together, being valuing your family, being valuing your nation. And I think that's important to take into account on whether the importance of sports development in each different country throughout the world. And what are you guys' takeaways for this episode?
Yeah, Ivan, that's a really like nice like realization. I also had a little bit of an epiphany that like there was definitely like a cultural impact. I think another like one of my takeaways is that like I guess like the current like recruiting the system, especially in the United States, like the ranking system, it's a little bit like it well, you have to like approach like the in some cases you have to approach the coaches themselves. In other cases, the scouts will directly go to you, and sometimes there's definitely like different like flaws in that system, and like we could definitely see that like maybe we can either have scouts like either like go to like more like rural or like less well known just to like see if there's like any prospects, or we could have like also like the rural athletes, they just like reach out to like the college coaches, college scouts, maybe set them up for like a little bit of like a trial or like a training with the team, like to see like if they like are like at that level as they think they are to potentially pursue an athletic career. Because right now the current system like kind of like some rural athletes are like kind of like left in the mud in terms of like if they want to like pursue their like athletic careers, like just because of like their situation. And it could I think the system could definitely be like improved through like different ways.
Yeah, my takeaway is just kind of like the positive ways, I guess, like a thriving sports program can impact a country's economy, especially like we not only in the US, also in China and different other countries. Like we've seen how much growth an economy has just from a program being successful, just because the athletes themselves bring so much value in their name. Like these are positive role models that like all these kids want to follow after. It's just continuous cycles of that, and not only in terms of that but also in terms of job creation and just like being a more desirable place to visit. I think a lot of that comes from sports and just the image that sports creates and the opportunities that they create as well. That's my takeaway.
Yeah, I think for me, one of my biggest takeaways was looking at like the inequality in the systems, because like Jack said, if you live in like a bigger town, like like, if your school already has like very established networkers with um like scouters or like recruiters or like even the coaches themselves, then you are just inherently at a much bigger advantage than like if you're some small rural town in Wyoming looking to get recruited for football, right? And I think that's like kind of a really big thing. And there's a lot of things like that where someone could have a lot of potential but isn't actually able to realize that potential, because like they weren't given the same amount of resources, the same opportunities, things like that. And I think that's kind of where it gets a little bit like less all cheery, like things like that with sports. But overall, I think like at the end of the day, sports is still very much like for onlookers, it's a form of entertainment, right? Like obviously for the players themselves, that's like a profession, that's like their life. But for the people sitting home on like Sunday evening watching football or like watching a basketball game, like that's just entertainment. Like there might be super fans out there who like are willing to do a lot for their teams, but for most people who are watching, it's still just a form of entertainment. And when you look at it that way, there is like schools, for example, like it's like a way for them to make money. And obviously because there's like a lot of money opportunities involved, it's really difficult for the schools to step away from that and look to be more like fair. So I think it's kind of a difficult dilemma for the schools and like just that system as a whole to be in. But
Yeah. So that is it for our episode on towards the importance of sports towards different nations around the world and taking into account the economy or even the culture of that nation. And thank you guys for tuning in into this episode of the Teens for Business podcast. And we'll see you guys next week.